Welcome to the second installment of my grand project to replicate the entire Battle of Waterloo in 28mm figures. This installment is going to be about the Prussians. The Prussian, formerly known as the Army of the Lower Rhine, was the effectively second Allied army to fight at Waterloo. I have represented in this project all the units that actually made it onto the battlefield at Waterloo. A lot of the units of the Prussians had fought previous days at the Battle of Nini, and were still on the march to the battlefield, and or in the case of the Third Corps, detached essentially to cover the Prussians' rear against Grouchy's French formations. So only about a corps and a half, 2 corps actually made it on the battlefield. So this army is a bit smaller, but certainly still very, very large in scope. As you can see here, there's just under 3,000 miniatures used to represent this force. And in the following, we're going to go through this group of figurines, through the unit composition. We'll talk a little bit about the design and layout. That said, I've covered most of the design concepts for this force in the earlier video covering the Anglo-Dutch, the Allied Wellington's army. And the principles here are the same. I'm using 50 by 50mm MDF bases, square for all formed troops, round for skirmishers in command, and 24 figures for a normal base, so 4 bases of 6 each, 36 figures, 6 bases of 6 each for large units. So the principles are the same. I encourage you to watch the other video first, and then come back here to have a look at the Prussians. So let's have a look at the force. In the flyover here, you have the entire Prussian contingent that made it on the battlefield. In the foreground, you have the 4th Corps, which was actually first on the battlefield and arrived completely. Then you have 2nd Corps, which just brought 2 brigades onto the field. And finally, 1st Corps was a single brigade. Front right here, you have Generalleutnant von Gneisenau, who's the head of the general staff for the whole army. And then front left, you have Generalleutnant von Zieten, who commanded 1st Corps. Steinmetz here commanding the 1st Infantry Brigade, which is composed of 3 regiments, each with 3 battalions. The first 2 regiments we're seeing right here are reserve battalions, the 12th and 24th in transition to new uniforms. Then you have the first of the Landwehr units. This is the first Westphalian Landwehr. You have the integrated artillery and the reserve artillery in the rear. There are lots of batteries of both 6-pounders and 12-pounders. And then coming forward here, we have the cavalry attached to 1st Corps. So this is a mix of Landwehr in the rear, Landwehr cavalry, and then Husaren, Ulanen, Dragoner, the typical formations. You see the very light blue of the dragoons here in the front, and then of course commander of the cavalry, which is Generalleutnant von Röder. Then we have 2nd Corps here under Pirsch. Again, 2 brigades in this one. The 1st Brigade, which is the 5th Brigade of the overall army, has the 3 infantry regiments, 2 line infantry, 1 Landwehr. The line infantry has fusiliers at the front, with their own skirmishers in order, and then the attached artillery in the far rear here. Coming forward now again is the 6th Brigade, which is the 2nd Infantry Brigade of 2nd Corps. This is same thing, Landwehr in the rear, and then you see the 2 line regiments. This will repeat over and over again. The only thing that varies are the number of Jäger and other skirmish elements attached. The Prussian brigades are very rigorous, always 3 regiment, always of 3 battalions. On the front here, you will see a few medical doctors and so forth, and of course the brigade commander. Then you have the cavalry attached to 2nd Corps, starting on the front with the dragoons. Then you have some hussars, and ultimately the Landwehr cavalry again in the rear with some very large regiments. This is the very big blocks there are 4th and 5th Kurmärkische Landwehr Kavallerie, so Kurmark, which is the sort of northern portion of modern day, historical day Prussia. And then here you have the main headquarters. So you have Generalfeldmarschall von Blücher on the right, and his chief of staff von Grohlmann, and then finally General Bülow, who commanded 4 corps. That corps is composed of 4 brigades, and each of them again composed of 3 regiments. You see the 3 regiments of 13th Brigade, which was the first of the 4. Different from the 1st and 2nd Corps, the 4th Corps brigades were primarily Landwehr, so each of their infantry brigades had 2 Landwehr regiments of 3 battalions each, and only 1 line regiment, and even those were often reserve formation, so this is kind of the poor man Charlie of the army. Despite this, they were largely unengaged in Ligny, and therefore were put in the first order of march and arrived on the battlefield early. These are the poor sods that stormed Plancenoit, ousted first Lobau's French corps, and then later, in fact, the Imperial Guard, both the Young Guard and some of the Old Guard, were pushed out by these brave souls. In the rear, you see the attached artillery, and we're sort of slowly zooming over the 4 infantry brigades here, all of them composed in the same way, 1 line regiment in the front, and then 2 Landwehr regiments of 3 battalions in the rear. You see some extra officers and attachments here. And then finally, we come to the cavalry formations attached to 4 corps. You have actually the king's brother, the Prince of Prussia, commanding the cavalry. Starting, you see the light blue dragoons as well, some hussars, some uhlans, Ulanen in German, and then a very large contingent of Landwehr cavalry that supported the division. Now that you've seen the army, I just wanted to add a few words on the composition and structure of the collection. Again, I encourage you to watch the video about the Anglo-Dutch army that I've posted almost 2 years ago now, which describes the more complex thought about the layout of the collection, the design, the basing, the painting, and so forth. I won't cover all that here again, but just briefly, in terms of the composition of the force, as I already mentioned, the Prussian army had the Prussian army of the Lower Rhine in this case, which was a contingent of the broader Prussian military force, had 4 corps. They were centrally commanded by Generalfeldmarschall von Blücher, the old man, the 72-year-old hero of so many battles, who just had a fiery hatred for the French. Under him, he had 4 corps, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each corps then was very standardized. The Prussians do like their standardization. So each corps had 4 brigades in it. The brigade concept is a bit of a misnomer in the case of the Prussians. Prussian brigade is more akin to a British or French division in size and also in composition. So each of these 4 corps would have integrated infantry, cavalry, and artillery, similar to a British division and unlike a British brigade. We'll come to that in a second. In addition to the 4 primary infantry brigades, which are really the fighting formations, you had a couple of independent brigades of reserve cavalry that operated separately from the corps brigades. These were the term brigade here means really standard brigade. So these have typically 2 to 4 regiments of cavalry in each. And then similarly, you have a reserve artillery contingent, which typically would be a mix of field and heavy artillery components. Some of the field artillery would be assigned. These were typically 6-pounders. They would be attached to the infantry units during the battle. And then the 12-pounder heavy guns were kept under direct control of the corps commander to support breakthroughs and other kind of grand batterie kind of activities. Zooming into the infantry brigades, these were composed primarily out of 3 infantry regiments, each regiment in turn having 3 battalions. If this was a line regiment, it would have a battalion of fusiliers with a bit more skirmishing capability, and then 2 battalions of musketeers, which also trained every 3rd man or so for forward deployment in skirmish order, but typically fought more in formed organizations. Then you would have attached cavalry. This was typically 2 squadrons, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, acting as a screening force under direct command of the brigade commander. And finally, you would have attached artillery, usually a 6-pounder battery that would work in direct conjunction with the infantry and separate from the corps level artillery. Finally, there are some peculiar elements of the Prussian army that I've tried to represent in various vignettes in the structure of the force. The first one is the dual command structure of any Prussian field army. You had the field commander, which is in this case Feldmarschall von Blücher, shown here, who was an overall tactical command of the force. He would be supported by a typical chief of staff organization that was subordinate to him. I've shown here Generalmajor von Rohlmann, who was the chief of staff of Blücher's army, with some staff officers and messengers and so forth. And then separate to that, you had the so-called Generalstab, general staff. This was a separate autonomous organization with the highest ranking officer in Blücher's army being Generalleutnant von Gneisenau, shown here, who was an independent senior commander that was responsible not for tactical operations on the field, but for planning, logistics, training, and all the other sort of professional function of a force. He reported directly to the general staff of the armed forces in Berlin, separate from the field commander. Another piece of novelty in the Prussian army is the Feldjäger Corps, or the Jägers in general. So Jäger is just the German word for hunter. Feldjäger, literally field hunters, were a mix between military police and messengers. It was typically senior non-commissioned officers. They had their own special green uniforms, typically mounted, and they would act as messengers between the command structure. And so what I've done to reflect that is that higher level command, so corps command and general staff and so forth, have typical ADCs, either in blue uniforms for infantry ADCs or white uniforms for cavalry ADCs. But brigade level commanders for the infantry brigades have Feldjäger in their green uniforms, and so you can see that here. This is von Zieten with his little Feldjäger attached in the ADC base, just to give a nod to that particular type of the Prussian idiosyncrasy. We then also have the Jäger themselves, often called Freiwillige Jäger, which means volunteer hunters. These were literally hunters. These were people that lived in the woods and were familiar with hunting. They were often good shots. And those that were attached in kind of semi-organized fashion to the infantry battalions, typically the line battalions. Some might have 20 people attached as a very small contingent. On the other hand, you might have some that had like 300 Jäger attached to a single battalion, making almost half the battalion in headcount, and in addition to the core unit. These operated independently on the battlefield in a sort of skirmish rifle style formation that the British would be familiar with, sharpshooters, hunting enemy officers, and so forth. That said, each regiment also had actual embedded skirmishers, so the typical sort of voltigeur type skirmishers that would come out of the line and Fusilier battalions to march forward and provide a skirmish screen. So I've represented those separately. I have the Jäger as green-clad special bases, and then I have the regular skirmishers in the same uniforms as their parent battalion, just in skirmish order on skirmish bases. And that's really it. Like I said, have a look at the Anglo-Dutch video to see any of the details about painting, basing, and process. Overall, this project took me about 18 months to complete. You see here it's a little bit over 2,500 figures. I won't go through all the stats, but lots of bases, lots of units, lots of little extra special things. It's about a quarter smaller than the Anglo-Dutch force, reflecting the fact that Wellington really had every single available unit on the field, with the exception of a very tiny number posted in the rear guard, whereas the Prussians were only able to bring a little bit less than half of their forces to bear on the battlefield, with the rest still on the line of march from Ligny, or actually from Wavre, where they had fallen back to after the very bloody Battle of Ligny. Thank you very much for your attention, and now it's time for the French. So I'll see you in a couple of years probably when I get those ones done. Thank you and goodbye.